My name is Ben. I've always been a man who stands firm in his beliefs. Some might say I'm rigid, but for me, it's all about discipline. I grew up in a family where a man's word held weight, where promises were sacred, and trust wasn't something you played around with. I've never been the type to make excuses or hand out second chances. You either lived with integrity or you didn't. It was that simple in my eyes. I believed in the old-fashioned way of doing things, where the man took on the role of provider, protector, and leader in the household. My wife, Sarah, well, she was different from me in almost every way imaginable. She had this easygoing, carefree nature. Whenever she laughed, it seemed to light up the entire room, and she always seemed so present, while I was more focused on structure and planning for what was ahead. When we first crossed paths, I was captivated by her spontaneity. It was like a spark I didn't even know was missing from my life. She made everything feel lighter, more effortless. But at the same time, there were parts of her that always rubbed me the wrong way. She didn't take life as seriously as I did. Ambition and drive weren't her strong suits. To her, it didn't matter if things didn't go according to plan. But for me, that kind of unpredictability was unbearable. I handled the decision-making, the finances, made sure everything in the house ran like clockwork. Sarah never worked, which honestly I preferred. It fit the image I had of what a family should look like. I saw a woman's place as being in the home, taking care of it, and maybe someday looking after the kids while I took care of everything else. That was my perspective, my duty. In the beginning, we balanced each other out. My strength grounded us, while her lightheartedness added some joy to my otherwise serious world. But over time, those differences started to feel less like a balance and more like a barrier between us. We lived in a small town, the kind where everybody knows everybody. It wasn't one of those sleepy little places you see in the movies. It had some life to it, but it wasn't big enough for you to fly under the radar either. That's an important detail. In a town like this, word gets around fast. Your business becomes everyone else's business, whether you like it or not. At first, I thought there was some comfort in that, knowing that people were always watching. It made sure your actions had consequences, kept you honest, or at least it was supposed to. We had moved here years ago when things between Sarah and me still felt fresh, when I believed we could build a life that would last. She loved the idea of living in a place like this, where the community felt close, where you could stroll down the street and folks would greet you by name. I wasn't opposed to it either. There's a kind of security in that lifestyle, a simplicity. It felt like the right place to settle down, to plant roots, and live out the life I had envisioned. A steady one, where I could work hard and return to a stable, predictable home. In a town like ours, people paid attention to everything. They noticed if your lawn wasn't mowed on time, if you skipped church on Sunday, or if you were out of town more than usual. You couldn't escape the watchful eyes of the neighbors. I always kept that in mind. I made sure I did what was expected of me. Never stepping out of line, never giving anyone reason to gossip. That, to me, was what kept a man's reputation intact. It wasn't just about how I viewed myself, but how others saw me too. And believe me, they saw it all. That's why it was so important to me that Sarah and I looked like a strong, united front. In my mind, appearances in a marriage mattered just as much as what happened behind closed doors. I needed people to see us as a family that had it all together, because in a place like this, once you lost people's respect, it was gone for good. And I wasn't about to let that happen. We'd been here long enough that folks no longer saw us as the new faces in town. We had become part of the fabric of the place. People in town were used to seeing us together, and to them, we seemed like the picture of a respectable, solid family. I put in the hard work, provided for my wife, and in return, she took care of managing the house. On the surface, everything looked just as it should. But in a place where eyes are always watching, you start to feel that pressure. I carried the weight of our reputation on my back, always making sure we lived up to what folks expected from us. This town wasn't just a place where we lived. It shaped every aspect of our lives. The way people looked at you, the whispers when something seemed off, it all mattered. I knew if things ever started to fall apart, there'd be no way to hide it. That's what made it all the more unbearable when the cracks began to show. At the time, though, I couldn't have imagined things would unravel. We'd been living here for so long, playing our roles, keeping up appearances. In a small town, that's supposed to be enough, right? But let's get to the point, because all these details I've mentioned, they're gonna come back and bite me harder than I ever expected. But before we get into that, you need to know how our life was structured. Sarah didn't work. She never had and never wanted to, and I was perfectly fine with that. Actually, I believed that's how it should be. As the man, it was my duty to take care of everything. Financially, physically, you name it. I grew up thinking that a man's job was to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, while the woman kept the home running smoothly. For me, it was a point of pride. I wanted Sarah to be comfortable, to have everything she needed without ever having to lift a finger outside of the house. I worked long hours, day in and day out, making sure we had enough to keep things going. I wasn't rich by any means, but we had a stable, solid life, and that's what mattered most to me. Security, stability, knowing I was doing what was expected of me. Every man should feel that sense of responsibility, I thought. That's what pushed me through the grind. As long as my wife was safe and happy at home, I figured I was fulfilling my role. Then one day, Sarah started talking about this new friend she'd made. At first, I didn't think much of it. People come and go, and women like to chat, right? She mentioned she'd met this woman through Instagram, of all places. It seemed harmless enough. Sarah said the whole thing started when this woman posted a story about taking pottery classes, making little bowls and sculptures out of clay. That's when the messages started, just casual back and forth over Instagram stories. I remember rolling my eyes when she first mentioned it. Social media wasn't my thing, but Sarah seemed to enjoy it, so I didn't make a big deal of it. Soon enough, Sarah started going to these pottery classes with her new friend, saying it was a good way for her to get out of the house and try something creative. I didn't pay much attention to it. I was at work most of the day, and if playing with clay for a couple of hours made her happy, what harm could it do? I figured it kept her occupied while I was out busting my tail to make sure we had a roof over our heads and food on the table. If it made her happy, that was fine with me. But over time, this friend started to become a bigger part of our lives. Sarah would go on and on about what they did at the pottery studio, what they talked about, and what projects they had planned. I could tell this new friendship excited her in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. At first, I didn't think much of it. Hell, I was happy she had someone to talk to. It took the pressure off me, not having to be her source of entertainment after those long, grueling workdays. I figured it was harmless. How wrong I was. See, I've always held the belief that a woman's place is in the home, and I handled everything else. I never once questioned that setup. But looking back now, maybe I should have. While I was out there working my fingers to the bone, thinking I was doing everything a good husband should, my wife was building a whole other life that I didn't see coming. And it all started with that one innocent Instagram post. In hindsight, all those little things, her not working, me clocking in long hours, the comfort I thought I was giving her, were setting the stage for what was about to happen. It's funny how the smallest details, the things you take for granted, are the ones that end up blowing up in your face. I kept at it, working long hours like always, grinding away because that's just what life was for me. Get up early, head out to work, and come home late. I knew it wore me down, but that's what I believed a man was supposed to do. I never complained. Taking care of Sarah and making sure everything was in order, that was my responsibility, and I took it seriously. No matter how many hours I worked, I always made sure to carve out some time for her. I'd come home with little surprises, maybe cook dinner every now and then, even if I was dead on my feet. I didn't want her to feel neglected just because I was out of the house most of the time. But then I started noticing something. Sarah was spending more and more time with that friend of hers. At first, it didn't bother me. I figured she needed a break and that it was good for her to have someone to talk to. But then it became constant. I'd come home, and instead of her greeting me or asking about my day, she'd be glued to her phone or chatting online with this friend. If she wasn't at the pottery studio, she was texting or making plans to meet up. I could feel her drifting away from me, like I wasn't even on her radar anymore, even though I was the one busting my back every day for us. It didn't take long for it to start getting under my skin. It wasn't just the time she was spending with this woman. It was how she acted about it. I tried to bring it up casually at first, saying something like, "You've been seeing that friend of yours a lot lately." She'd brush it off, saying it was no big deal, just something to keep her busy since she was stuck at home all day. I wanted to believe her, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the amount of time, it was the growing distance between us. I'd come home after a long day, and she'd be more excited to talk about pottery than anything we had together. It was like I didn't even matter anymore. When I finally confronted her about it, because I'm not the type to let things fester, she got defensive. She snapped back at me, saying, "What's the big deal? It's just a friend. I'm still here, aren't I? I'm still home when you get back." And that's what really got to me. Yeah, she was home, but it didn't feel like she was there. Her mind was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't reach. I tried to explain to her that it felt like she was putting this friend before our marriage, before everything we had built together. But she made it seem like I was blowing things out of proportion, like I was the unreasonable one. "Why are you making this into a problem?" she'd ask, as if I was at fault. "It's not like I'm going anywhere. You're always at work anyway. What do you expect me to do? Just sit around all day waiting for you?" That stung. I never expected her to sit around, but I also didn't expect her to act like all my hard work didn't mean anything. It was as if everything I was doing, putting in those long hours, keeping the household running smoothly, just didn't matter to her. The more time she spent with that friend, the more the tension between us grew. I tried bringing it up again, this time with a little more urgency, but every conversation spiraled into a fight. She started accusing me of being controlling, of trying to tell her who she could or couldn't spend time with. I wasn't trying to control her. I just wanted to figure out why she was slipping away from me. But no matter what I said, she brushed it off. "I'm still home," she'd say, like that was supposed to be enough. But being physically there and being emotionally present are two completely different things. Now that I look back, I can see this was the beginning of something much bigger, something I was too blind to notice at the time. Back then, I still believed that if I worked hard enough, if I provided enough, everything would just fall into place. I didn't realize how far apart we were drifting until it was already too late. A few days passed, and the tension between us had only grown worse. Sarah and I weren't talking as much, and when we did, it was like there was this unspoken distance. Then one evening, I saw something that caught me off guard. She was getting ready, and I mean really getting ready. Her makeup was done perfectly, her hairstyle just right, and she was dressed like she was headed to some special event. It struck me because it had been a long time since she'd dressed up like that, and certainly not for me. Usually, she kept it casual around the house. But tonight, it looked like she was getting ready for something important, something that clearly mattered to her. Curious, I asked her what the occasion was. She told me her friend, the same one she'd been spending all that time with, was coming to pick her up, and they were going out. The whole thing didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that she was going out. It was the way she shrugged it off like it was no big deal. Trying to keep things light, I suggested, "Why don't you invite her over here first? We could all sit down, have a drink, and then you can head out." I figured it would be a good chance to meet this friend I'd heard so much about. Maybe if I met her, it would put my mind at ease, make everything feel less strange. But Sarah wasn't interested. She waved me off, saying, "It's too late for that. We're in a rush, no time for anything." Her tone was sharp and hurried, unlike her usual self. Something about the whole situation felt off. She wasn't usually this distant or cold, but at that moment, it seemed like all she wanted was to get out the door as fast as she could. The more I tried to talk to her, the more she brushed me aside. "Don't worry, it's nothing. We're just going out for a bit," she said, acting like it was no big deal. Then I heard a car pull up outside. A sleek, polished black sedan, the kind of car that seemed out of place in our small town. I glanced out the window and saw it sitting at the curb, engine running. It wasn't what I expected. For some reason, I had imagined her friend would drive something more practical, maybe a beat-up car like most folks around here. But this car, it stood out. I looked back at Sarah, and for a second, our eyes met. I asked, "Is that your friend?" But she didn't answer. She just grabbed her purse and said, "I'll be back later. Don't wait up." Everything about this felt wrong, but I didn't want to push it. I let her go, watching as she hurried out the door and slid into that black sedan. I stood there, staring after them as the taillights flickered and the car disappeared into the night. For a moment, I thought about following them, asking more questions. But I convinced myself it was nothing. Just a girl's night out, right? I told myself not to make a big deal out of it. She said they were in a rush, no time for anything else. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I went back inside, trying to focus on something else. But that uneasy feeling stuck with me. The black sedan, the way she was dressed, the hurried way she left. It all felt off, like something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I couldn't quite figure out why it didn't sit right with me. So I let it go for now. Later that night, maybe a couple of hours after Sarah had left, my phone rang. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, so when I picked up and heard the words, "Your wife is in the hospital," it hit me like a ton of bricks. The voice on the other end, a nurse I think, was calm but straight to the point. Sarah had been in a car accident. My heart sank. I didn't even wait for the details. I was already grabbing my keys and heading for the door. The nurse mentioned something about a possible concussion and a few injuries, but that was all I caught before I hung up and sped toward the hospital. The drive felt like a blur, my mind racing with all sorts of thoughts. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight as I tried to figure out what could have happened. Was her friend, the one driving the black sedan, involved? Or was it someone else? The questions kept coming, but I shoved them aside. All I could focus on was getting to Sarah. She was my wife, and no matter what was going on, I had to be there for her. When I finally got to the hospital, they took me straight to her room. She looked shaken, pale, but alive. She had a few bruises here and there and was clearly still a bit out of it from the concussion. I felt a wave of relief when I saw her sitting up in bed. The doctor told me she'd be fine, just needed some rest. They'd done all the necessary tests, and soon she'd be able to go home. I sat by her side, holding her hand, asking if she was all right. She mumbled something about the accident, how it all happened so fast, but she didn't say much else. The doctor reassured me it was normal for her to be confused because of the head injury. Within a few hours, they discharged her, and I took her home. She was still groggy, so I made sure she was comfortable. Got her some water, helped her into bed. All I could think about was how lucky we were that it wasn't worse. Whatever had happened, she was alive, and that's what mattered. I was determined to take care of her, to make sure she had everything she needed while she recovered. The accident had rattled me, but it also brought back that sense of duty I'd always felt as her husband. I pushed aside any lingering doubts or suspicions I'd had. This was my wife, and right now, her well-being was my priority. But just as I was starting to settle into that mindset, my phone rang again. I glanced at the clock. It was late, way too late for a casual call. When I answered, I immediately recognized the voice on the other end. It was a buddy of mine who worked in the police department, and from the sound of his voice, I knew this wasn't going to be just a friendly chat. He hesitated, like he didn't want to say what was coming next. "You're not going to like this, but I have to tell you," he started. "We've been going over the details of the accident involving your wife." My stomach tightened as he continued. "Look, this isn't official yet, but I didn't want you to hear it any other way." I didn't say a word. I just waited, heart pounding, bracing myself. "The thing is," he went on, "your wife wasn't with that friend of hers like she said. She was with a guy. We don't have all the specifics yet, but he was the one driving the car." I froze. "A guy?" She told me she was going out with her friend, the same woman she'd been spending all that time with lately. How the hell was there a man involved? A wave of confusion hit me, but I didn't have time to even process that before my friend dropped another bombshell. "There's more," he said quietly, like he didn't even want to say it out loud. "We've got footage from a traffic camera near the crash site, and it shows that the guy driving, well, his pants were down. And your wife, she was, it looks like she was giving him head while he was driving." The words hit me like a punch straight to the gut. Sarah in that car with her head in some guy's lap, while they were driving. I just stood there, stunned, my mind trying to reject what I had just heard. But the truth was crashing down on me fast. I couldn't wrap my head around it. My wife, who told me she was going out with a friend, had actually been with a man doing that? The same woman who brushed me off before leaving, telling me not to wait up, had been on her knees for some stranger while they recklessly drove, ending up in an accident. I was speechless, struggling to make sense of it all. My friend's voice softened, like he understood how much this was hitting me. "I'm really sorry, man. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but I figured you needed to hear it from someone who cares about you." My mind was spinning, filled with images of that black sedan. The way Sarah had hurried out the door, dressed up like she was heading somewhere important. And here she was, tangled up with some guy, doing something I never thought she'd do, especially in such a reckless way. All those stories she told me about her friend, the pottery classes, it was all lies. This guy had been around the whole time, and I'd been completely blind to it. My throat tightened, and my chest burned with a mix of anger and humiliation. I wanted to ask my friend more, demand answers, but I couldn't even find the words. All I could think was, how could she do this to me? After a moment of silence, I managed to mutter something, maybe a thank you, and then hung up. I stood there, feeling like my entire world had just unraveled. Sarah was in the next room, lying in bed, recovering from the accident. But now I knew the truth. She wasn't the innocent victim I thought she was. She'd betrayed me in a way I never could have imagined. For a few minutes after that call, I just stood there, staring at nothing, my mind swirling with disbelief, anger, and betrayal. The weight of what I just learned hit me hard. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I needed to confront her, to hear it from her own mouth. Maybe part of me still wanted to believe there was some other explanation, that it couldn't be what it seemed. But deep down, I knew. She had lied, and I needed her to admit it. I walked into the bedroom, where Sarah was resting, still looking pale and weak from the accident. She glanced up at me, her eyes wide, but I didn't care about her condition at that moment. I needed answers. Without mincing words, I asked, "What the hell were you doing in that car with that man?" My voice was low, controlled, but the rage was boiling just beneath the surface. Her eyes widened, and for a second, she didn't say anything, like she was struggling to process what I had just asked. But her reaction gave her away instantly. Instead of denying it or pretending to be confused, she blurted out, "How did you find out?" The second those words left her mouth, I knew. She hadn't planned on telling me anything. She wasn't going to come clean unless I confronted her. She looked at me, realizing too late what she had just let slip. There was a heavy silence between us, her words hanging in the air. She knew she'd messed up, and there was no going back now. Her expression shifted, and suddenly she was pleading. "Wait, please," she said, her voice shaky. "Just listen to me. Let me explain before you do anything." She could see the fury in my eyes, could probably feel how close I was to losing it. But she wasn't stupid. She knew I wouldn't walk away without hearing the whole story. "Promise me you won't kick me out," she begged, her eyes wide with desperation. "Promise you'll hear me out first." I crossed my arms, staring down at her, barely containing the storm brewing inside me. "Fine," I said, my voice cold. "Talk, but this better be good." She took a deep breath, clearly trying to steady herself. She didn't have a choice now. The lies were falling apart, and whatever excuses she might come up with weren't going to save her this time. I could see the fear in her eyes, the panic, as she scrambled to explain something so disgusting, so humiliating. Sarah began to speak, her voice shaky as she tried to justify what she had done. I stood there, arms crossed, listening to every word, but I could tell she was stalling, trying to figure out the best way to frame it. I wasn't going to let her off that easy, though. The truth was out, and now she had to face it head-on. But in that moment, I didn't know if there was anything she could say that would make a difference. The damage had already been done. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she began. "You were always at work," she started, her eyes darting everywhere but at me. "I know you were providing for us, I get that, but I was so lonely. You were never home, and when you were, it felt like you weren't really here." She paused, biting her lip, searching for the right words to somehow justify what she'd done. "That's why it happened," she continued. "That's why I started seeing him. He wasn't just a friend. It wasn't a woman. It was a guy and we had a relationship. I stood there, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. She wasn't even trying to sugarcoat it anymore. This wasn't just some mistake or a one-time thing. This was a full-blown affair. So, it was never a friend, I muttered, more to myself than to her. All this time, while I was out busting my ass, she'd been sneaking around with some guy. The words left a bitter taste in my mouth. Sarah looked down, unable to meet my gaze, like the weight of the truth had finally become too much for her to bear. But I wasn't finished. I wasn't going to let her throw out excuses without acknowledging the promises she had made to me years ago. You stood there, I said, my voice low but steady. On our wedding day, you promised me you would love me, that you would be faithful. You looked me in the eye and swore you'd stand by me no matter what. Does that mean nothing to you now? Her face twisted in guilt, and she nodded slowly. I did promise, she whispered. But I didn't know how hard it would get. You weren't here. I didn't feel loved anymore. I was desperate for attention, and he gave me what I was missing. Her words stung, but they didn't break me. If anything, they made me more certain of what needed to be done. So your promises mean nothing, then? I said, my voice cold, the anger seeping through. If your commitment to me was so fragile, then I guess I was wrong to ever trust you. She flinched at my words, but I wasn't done. If your relationships and your promises don't matter, then neither do mine. I watched as confusion flashed across her face, quickly replaced by fear. She didn't understand what I meant yet, but she would soon enough. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes wide as the reality of the situation began to sink in. I let her question hang in the air for a moment, watching as she tried to piece together what I was about to do. The betrayal she had inflicted on me was about to come full circle, and I wasn't going to spare her from the consequences. She had already torn us apart, and now she was going to feel the weight of what she had done. Her question, "What do you mean?" lingered in the air, but I didn't bother answering. My silence was answer enough. I walked away from the bedroom, my mind racing, my heart pounding, but my decision was crystal clear. There was no room for doubt, no place for second chances. She had crossed a line, and I couldn't stay under the same roof with someone who had betrayed me like that. As I entered the living room, something inside me snapped, and all I could think about was getting rid of her, of everything that reminded me of her deceit. I started with the closet. Everything that reminded me of her betrayal had to go. I started with the closet. Her clothes, every dress, every pair of shoes. I yanked them off the hangers and tossed them into a pile. Every time I touched one of her things, it felt like I was shedding the weight of her lies. One by one, I hurled them out the door and onto the lawn. The anger fueled me, gave me a sense of purpose. This was the one thing I had control over now. She had taken my pride, but I could take everything else. Next came her bags, her purses, and all the silly little trinkets scattered around the house. Things that once made our home feel warm now felt tainted. I didn't care if the neighbors saw. Let them witness what she had done. Let them see what happens when you betray someone's trust. I wanted her shame laid bare for everyone to see. As I kept throwing things out, I heard her footsteps behind me. "What are you doing?" Sarah cried, her voice full of panic. "Stop. Please stop." She rushed toward me, trying to grab at the clothes and belongings that were now scattered across the yard. But I didn't stop. I shoved her aside, my focus unbroken. I wasn't about to let her play the victim. Not now, not after everything she'd done. "Get out," I muttered through clenched teeth, still tossing more of her things out the door. She begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, we can talk about this." But her words meant nothing to me. There was nothing left to discuss. Each item I threw out felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself she had stolen. The bags, the shoes, the framed photos of us, everything had to go. She didn't belong here anymore. Not in this house, not in my life. I didn't stop until the house was practically empty of her presence. She stood there in the doorway, pale, watching as her life with me was reduced to a pile of discarded belongings on the lawn. She tried to speak again, to reason with me, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of my own resolve. She was out. Everything she had touched, everything that reminded me of her, was out. The divorce was anything but peaceful. What started as a quiet discussion about separating quickly turned into a battlefield. Sarah fought tooth and nail to hold on to whatever she could from the life we had built together. But I was done. I felt nothing but betrayal and anger, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate the situation any further. Each meeting with the lawyers was tense, as both sides fought over terms that neither of us could ever really be satisfied with. I was determined to move on, but it felt like I was dragging the weight of our broken marriage behind me. When the day finally came for the divorce to be finalized, I sat in the courtroom, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. The judge went through the formalities, and I glanced over at Sarah sitting across from me, her face a blend of anger and regret. Signing the papers felt like signing away a part of my life, but I also felt an immense sense of release. Once the documents were signed, it was like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was finally free to reclaim my life, to figure out who I was without her. In the weeks and months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I picked up new hobbies, reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in forever, and started working out more, channeling my anger and frustration into something productive. There were moments when I caught myself thinking about the good times we'd shared, but those memories were always overshadowed by the reality of her betrayal. It was hard to reconcile the love I once had with the pain she caused me. Sarah, on the other hand, struggled to find her footing after the divorce. The life she had envisioned for herself had crumbled, and though she tried to keep up appearances, I could see the toll it was taking on her. Friends who once stood by us began to drift away, caught in the middle of our fallout. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was trying to move on, but it all seemed forced, like she was desperately trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled. As time passed, I noticed a shift in my own emotions. The anger that had consumed me was slowly giving way to something else: acceptance. I began to see the divorce not just as an ending, but as a new beginning. I had the chance to redefine my life, to chase dreams I had pushed aside during our marriage. I embraced the opportunity to explore new relationships, to meet people who appreciated me for who I was, not who I had been with Sarah. Eventually, I decided to move to a new town to truly start fresh. I wanted to leave the old memories behind and create new ones in a place where I wouldn't be constantly reminded of the past. It was liberating to reinvent myself, to build a life free from the shadows of betrayal. I found new passions, met incredible people, and discovered happiness in unexpected places. Each day felt like a step closer to reclaiming my life. This whole experience taught me invaluable lessons about trust and self-worth. I learned the importance of being vigilant in my relationships and of valuing honesty above all else. I also realized that love shouldn't be a burden or a source of pain. It should lift you up and inspire you. The scars from my marriage would always be there, but they became reminders of what I wouldn't tolerate in the future. In the end, I came to understand that sometimes life's toughest challenges lead to the most profound growth. The divorce was one of the hardest things I've ever faced, but it set me on a path towards self-discovery and resilience. The moral of this story is simple: betrayal cuts deep, but it can also spark a fire within you to rise above, to seek a brighter future, and to embrace the power of starting over.